The image that changed everything was not a crown, not a balcony wave, and not some polished palace photo. It was a boy, 14 years old, standing in Westminster Hall, head bowed, shoulders still, not moving, not fidgeting, not once. Around him stood the most watched family in the world, inside one of the most emotional royal moments of the century, as Queen Elizabeth II lay in state before millions watching across the globe. And there was James, a teenager, standing guard over his grandmother's coffin with a calm that looked almost impossible at his age. That was the moment many people first stopped and asked themselves the same question. Who exactly is this boy? Because on that particular occasion, he did not look like the youngest member of a supporting royal branch. He did not look like someone just there to fill a place in the lineup. He looked like someone who understood the weight of the room. Someone who understood what duty meant before most people his age even know what they want to do with their lives. And now, years later, that same quiet boy has stepped into a role that could shift the future of the monarchy in a way almost no one saw coming. James Alexander Philip Theo Mountbatten Windsor has accepted the title of Prince. And if you think this is just about style, rank, or some formal palace paperwork, then no. That is not the real story. The real story is deeper than that. The real story is about a young man who spent nearly his whole life being underestimated because he did not demand attention. He did not chase headlines. He did not sell his image. He did not turn himself into content. He stayed quiet. He learned. He watched. He waited. And now the monarchy may be discovering that the one person it needed most was there all along. That is why royal watchers have been holding their breath over this moment. Not because another young man got a title. The family has had princes before. The world has seen handsome royal boys grow into royal men many times. But this feels different. It feels different because James did not grow up in the usual way people expect from someone born that close to the throne. He was not raised with the full noise of princely identity hanging over him from the beginning. He did not spend childhood walking into every room with a title doing the work for him. He was raised with distance from that. Raised to understand ordinary life. Raised to earn respect before receiving it. And that detail matters more than most people realize. Accounts from royal journalists and palace observers have said for years that James carried himself with a kind of seriousness unusual for someone so young. Not coldness. Not stiffness. Seriousness. There is a difference. Seriousness is not about trying to look important. It is about understanding that some things are bigger than your mood, your ego, or your need to be seen. That is the atmosphere around him now. Not noise. Not spectacle. Something heavier. Because what many people do not know is that the title was not simply dumped on him the second he came of age, like a gift placed in his lap whether he wanted it or not. The legal right may have existed, but accepting it carried meaning. Real meaning. And by waiting, by not rushing toward the status of it all, James changed the entire emotional texture of the decision. He made it look chosen. That is the part that has hit people so strongly. In an age when so many public figures grab at visibility the second it is available, here was a young royal doing the opposite. Not lunging. Not performing. Not announcing himself with a flourish. Just moving forward when the institution, and perhaps his own conscience, said the time had come. He did not take the title because he was hungry for status. He took it when duty called for it. And yes, that sounds dramatic. But that is exactly why this story is landing so hard with people who follow the royal family closely. Because for years the dominant royal storyline has been one of conflict, self-definition, resentment, rebellion, escape, exposure. Everything loud. Everything public. Everything emotionally spilled out in front of cameras. Then along comes James, and he represents the opposite instinct. Silence. Restraint. Patience. The kind of patience that does not scream to be noticed. There is also something else here, something whispered more and more often in royal circles. People are not just reacting to James as a person. They are reacting to what he seems to symbolize. A correction. A reset. A reminder of an older royal code that many thought was fading out. A code built on not saying everything. A code built on staying steady when everyone else is spinning. A code built on service before self. That is why this title acceptance feels larger than the paperwork behind it. It feels like the closing of one chapter and the beginning of another. It feels like the House of Windsor quietly placing weight onto a new shoulder and discovering that shoulder is stronger than expected. And if you trace this story backward, if you go beneath the polished headlines and the neat little constitutional language, you end up somewhere very far from palace ceremony. You end up by a river in Scotland. Cold water. Grey sky. A fishing rod. A grandfather who understood discipline better than almost anyone in modern royal history. And a boy who was listening. Because this story did not begin when James accepted the title of prince. It began long before that. It began when someone in that family looked at the youngest, quietest boy in the room and seemed to realize he might one day matter far more than anyone yet understood. And once you see that thread, once you follow it properly, everything else starts to make sense. Not all at once, but piece by piece. To understand why this moment carries so much weight, you have to go back to the beginning, and not in the grand, ceremonial way royal stories are usually told. Not with trumpets. Not with christening robes. Not with those polished photo calls where everyone smiles like history is happening on schedule. No, this begins with a decision made quietly by his parents, Prince Edward and Sophie, a decision that turned out to be far more important than it looked at the time. When James was born, there was every reason for him to be styled in a much more openly royal way from the start. That is what people expected. That is what the system often does. Titles come early, and with them comes a whole invisible structure, deference, distance, privilege, and a childhood shaped by formal identity. But Sophie and Edward chose something different. They decided their children would not be raised wrapped in that full royal shield. They would grow up more like the children of an earl than little palace celebrities. Less insulated. Less inflated. More connected to normal life. At the time, some people saw that as modest. Some saw it as clever. Others thought it was a gamble. Looking back now, it may have been one of the smartest parenting decisions made anywhere near the monarchy in decades. Because it meant James had to move through the world without the constant reinforcement of, "You are special, therefore the world bends." He had to learn how to enter rooms and make his own impression. He had to listen. He had to speak properly. He had to show manners that were not just decorative, but functional. He had to understand people, not just stand apart from them. That changes a person. It changes the spine. It changes the way you read a room. It changes the way you think about your own place in it. James was not raised to assume importance. He was raised to prove character. And this is where Sophie's role becomes impossible to ignore. People who follow the royal family seriously have said for years that she was one of the steadiest and smartest figures inside it. Never the loudest. Never desperate for coverage. But deeply respected. Trusted. Grounded. The kind of person who understood that survival in royal life is not about sparkle. It is about structure. And she seems to have passed that understanding to her son. Royal insiders have often described James as unusually balanced. Not because he had no pressure, but because he was taught how to live alongside it. He knew where he came from, of course. He knew the bloodline, the history, the expectations. But he also knew buses, queues, ordinary conversation, and what it feels like to move in the world without a title doing all the heavy lifting. That matters because it gave him something rare in royal life: texture. He was not only shaped by institution. He was shaped by experience. Then there was Prince Philip. And this is where the story turns from interesting to almost eerie. Because again and again, accounts from those who watched the family closely return to the same detail: James and Philip had a special bond. Not a publicized one. Not one turned into glossy palace mythology every 5 minutes. A quieter bond. The kind that grows through repeated times spent together rather than carefully staged moments. People spoke often of their fly fishing trips at Balmoral. Now, to outsiders, that can sound almost laughably aristocratic. A grandfather and grandson fishing in Scotland. Fine. Nice image. Move on. But that misses the point completely. Fly fishing is not just some lazy upper-class hobby where you stand around pretending to be thoughtful. Done properly, it demands patience, stillness, observation, timing, control. You cannot bully a river. You cannot rush it. You cannot impose yourself on it like some spoiled child demanding attention. You have to read it. Respect it. Work with it. Wait until the right moment reveals itself. That sounds familiar, doesn't it? Because it is almost the perfect training ground for the kind of temperament royal life requires at its best. Prince Philip understood systems. He understood restraint. He understood the value of emotional discipline, even if the public did not always find him warm or easy. He was, in many ways, the monarchy's hard internal frame. The person who held standards in place when softer personalities might have let them slip. And something in James seems to have answered that. Many are questioning how much of James's present composure was formed on those Scottish afternoons. Quite a lot, by the look of it. The stillness people noticed later at formal events did not appear out of nowhere. The way he studies before speaking. The way he seems to settle into silence instead of fearing it. That kind of behavior usually has roots. Those fishing trips may have looked small from the outside. They were not small. They were lessons. Lessons in patience. Lessons in observation. Lessons in how not to make yourself the center of every scene. Prince Philip did not just teach James how to fish. He may have taught him how to carry power without chasing it. And then came the vigil at Westminster, the moment that made people look again. When James stood there at 14, many saw dignity. But those who had been paying close attention saw something more. They saw a pattern. They saw the upbringing. They saw Sophie's restraint. They saw Philip's discipline. They saw a child who had not been raised to perform importance, but who could step into a historic moment and hold himself with almost startling seriousness. That image stayed with people. Because it did not feel rehearsed. It felt earned. After that, the conversations changed. Not loudly. Not publicly at first. But within royal commentary, among journalists, insiders, and people who studied the family beyond headlines, there was a shift. James was no longer simply the youngest one, or Edward and Sophie's son. He became someone to watch. Still, even then, there were no grand announcements. No dramatic rollout. No aggressive branding of a new royal star. He remained largely protected from overexposure, which may have been another quiet act of wisdom. The less he was pushed, the more natural his emergence felt. The less he was sold, the more believable he became. And that matters. Because in royal life, overexposure can cheapen almost anything. So he grew. Quietly. Carefully. And while much of the public was busy watching the family's louder dramas unfold elsewhere, another story was taking shape off to the side. Smaller in volume. Bigger in consequence. A boy raised without the full force of title. A mother who understood the future. A grandfather who taught discipline in silence. And a family institution, whether it knew it fully yet or not, preparing to lean on him one day. Then came the moment that proved this was not just theory. It happened far from Westminster. Far from mourning. Far from Scotland. It happened on tour. And that is when people began to understand that James was not merely well brought up. He was ready. The real turning point did not arrive with a document, a seal, or a palace announcement. It arrived in motion. On tour. In South Africa. That was the occasion when the wider world got a clearer look at James not as a child of the family, not as a background figure, but as a young man moving through public life under pressure. And what made it so striking was that he did not arrive carrying the full force of princely styling with him. He was there as the Earl of Wessex, a significant title, yes, but not one that automatically creates the same instant psychological reaction as Prince. That detail matters, because it meant the responses he received were not simply being pulled out of people by a grand label. They had to come from somewhere else. They came from him. Accounts from journalists and observers who followed the tour described something unusual, especially for someone so young. Instead of stepping into every interaction as the focal point, James often seemed to do the opposite. He would take half a step back. He would listen first. He would watch the faces in front of him. He would read the mood before adding anything. That sounds simple until you understand how rare it is. Most people in highly visible roles, especially young people under scrutiny, become hyper-aware of themselves. How they look. How they sound. Whether they are saying enough. Whether they are saying too much. The inner noise gets loud. James did not seem trapped in that noise. He looked attentive. Genuinely attentive. And people notice when attention is real. Local leaders reportedly came away from conversations with him surprised by how specific he was in response. How clear it was that he had actually heard what they said instead of just waiting for his turn to speak. Conservation figures were said to be struck by the quality of his questions. Community representatives who may have expected polished politeness found themselves dealing with someone who seemed honestly interested. That kind of presence cannot be faked for long. And this is where the deeper royal issue begins to surface, because while James was earning respect in real time, the monarchy itself was still dealing with a structural problem created over several years. For all the public emotion around family rifts and departures, one hard reality sat beneath it: the institution needed people. Not just bodies for events. Not just names on paper. It needed reliable working royals who could carry engagements, embody loyalty, and move without turning every appearance into personal theater. That shortage had been felt for years. There had been discussion, adjustment, reshuffling, but the underlying need remained. The monarchy required a young figure who could connect with the public while also remaining anchored to the institution. Someone modern enough to feel relevant, disciplined enough to feel safe, and serious enough to carry weight beyond a headline cycle. During the South Africa tour, many seemed to have realized that James might be exactly that person, which created a strange kind of crisis. Not a loud crisis. A revealing one. Because once a person like that appears, once the institution sees a solution standing right in front of it, the old arrangements begin to look temporary. The palace no longer has the luxury of pretending the next generation will simply sort itself out on its own. Suddenly there is a real option. A real asset. A real future role waiting to be shaped. And then the pressure changes. The question is no longer whether James has potential. The question becomes what the palace will do with it. By the end of that tour, it was becoming harder to see James as a peripheral royal. He looked like a load-bearing one. That is when whispers started growing louder. Not tabloid nonsense. Something more focused. More institutional. The sense that James had quietly passed a test most people did not even know he was taking. He had walked into international public life without demanding the center of the frame, and somehow ended up commanding respect anyway. That is a dangerous thing in royal dynamics, in the best possible sense. Because once people see quiet competence, they start comparing it to noise. And comparison has haunted this family for years. You can feel the tension in the story at that point. On one side, an institution battered by public drama, changing expectations, and reduced manpower. On the other side, a young man shaped by patience, loyalty, and grounded upbringing, now visibly capable of carrying responsibility. Something had to give. What happened next was not a shouting match or a dramatic scandal. This story does not move like that. It moves the way serious institutions often move when they are making their most consequential choices, slowly, carefully, and with an eye on timing. But underneath that calm, a decision was gathering force. James had reached the age where the question of title could no longer remain abstract forever. The legal framework was there. The entitlement existed. Yet what mattered most was not whether the palace could style him differently. It was whether doing so now would reflect something true rather than ceremonial. That was the confrontation at the heart of it all. Not James versus the family. Not ambition versus resistance. But timing versus readiness. Status versus meaning. Was he ready to step forward officially? And perhaps even more important, was the institution ready to say, clearly and publicly, that this was the young man in whom it now placed real trust? The answer, once it came, said everything. He accepted. And in doing so, he changed the emotional meaning of the title itself. Because if he had grabbed for it the first second he could, it might have looked ordinary. Predictable. Automatic. Just another royal inheritance delivered on schedule. But that is not what happened. Instead, the acceptance came after visible proof of character. After years of quiet preparation. After public moments that showed discipline under pressure. After a tour that made it increasingly obvious he could meet the world without leaning on rank alone. So when the title finally came, it did not feel like a costume. It felt like recognition. Still, the full truth was larger than the decision itself. Because this was not only about James stepping up. It was also about the monarchy revealing what kind of future it now wants. And once that became visible, the entire picture sharpened. So what is the real truth underneath all this? It is not just that James accepted the title of prince. It is that the monarchy appears to have found in him the kind of figure it has been needing for years, someone young, credible, disciplined, modern. And yet deeply aligned with the old internal logic of service. That combination is rare. It is rare in public life generally. It is even rarer in a royal family, where visibility can distort character and privilege can soften discipline if no one is careful. But in James, accounts from observers, journalists, and insiders keep circling the same qualities again and again. Calm, restraint, seriousness, intelligence, loyalty, and perhaps most important of all, a lack of obvious hunger for self-display. That last point matters more than it may seem. The modern monarchy has spent years being dragged into a world that rewards constant confession, personal branding, emotional exhibition, and narrative ownership. Everyone is expected to explain themselves publicly now. To tell their story, to frame their pain, to market their identity. And in some corners of public life, that is treated not just as normal, but as morally superior. James represents another model. He has not built himself through exposure. He has not turned privacy into a performance. He has not made himself central by narrating every feeling to the world. Instead, he has let people infer who he is from what he does. That creates mystery, yes, but it also creates trust. Because when someone says less and consistently behaves well, their actions start to carry unusual force. And the truth is, the palace knows this. It knows what it has in him. That is why the title acceptance feels strategic without feeling cynical. It does not look like a flashy PR move. It looks like the public recognition of a long internal conclusion. The monarchy has been watching this young man become himself, and now it is willing to place him more clearly inside the structure. Not as decoration. As support. As reinforcement. As part of the future working core. The monarchy has not just gained a prince. It may have gained the one young royal most prepared to make duty believable again. There is another layer here too, and it may be one of the most important. James appears to bring something intellectually useful, not just symbolically useful. His reported interest in science, technology, engineering, conservation, defense systems, and the practical world of modern institutional problem-solving gives him relevance in a way the monarchy badly needs. The future is not built only on ribbons, ceremonies, and patronages in name. It increasingly depends on whether royal figures can engage seriously with the forces shaping national life. If James can do that, and many seem to believe he can, then he becomes more than a graceful presence. He becomes a bridge. A bridge between old royal duty and modern public value. A bridge between ceremony and competence. A bridge between inherited role and earned credibility. That is a very powerful thing. And then there is William. The relationship between James and the Prince of Wales is one of those subjects that royal watchers speak about with growing interest, because it points to something larger than personality. It points to structure. If William is the future sovereign, then who stands beside him matters enormously. Monarchies do not endure because one person is extraordinary. They endure because the sovereign is supported by people who are trustworthy, loyal, stable, and willing to serve without constantly competing for the spotlight. That supporting role can make or break a reign. Many are questioning how significant James may become in that inner framework, and the answer may be very significant. He is young enough to defer without threatening, mature enough to contribute without being decorative, disciplined enough to support without leaking instability into the system. That is no small thing, especially in a family where support has not always arrived in the form it was hoped for. So yes, public reaction to his elevation has carried a particular emotional charge. Some people see hope in it. Others see correction. Others see proof that the monarchy can still renew itself from within rather than only reacting to crisis from outside. And even among those who are skeptical of monarchy as a whole, there is a visible acknowledgement that James represents a different kind of royal figure than the ones who have dominated so much coverage in recent years. He feels less theatrical, less consumed by self-definition, more rooted. That has social meaning, not just palace meaning. Because what he symbolizes is bigger than one title. He symbolizes a kind of answer to a question many younger people have been asking, whether consciously or not: is there still such a thing as duty freely chosen? Not obligation forced by image. Not service used as branding. But real duty. Quiet duty. Chosen with open eyes. James's story, at least in the way it is now being understood, says yes. And that may be why it lands so deeply. Because in a culture exhausted by noise, the quiet figure often becomes the most compelling one in the room. The aftermath of this shift is likely to unfold gradually. That is how royal change usually works when it is serious. There will be patronages, affiliations, greater visibility, more responsibility, more direct integration into the active framework of the monarchy. And each of those steps will test whether the promise people think they see in James holds under greater pressure. But that is the point. He has already spent years being prepared for pressure. Not in flashy ways. In patient ways. By a mother who understood grounding. By a grandfather who taught stillness. By a system that, perhaps accidentally and perhaps wisely, allowed him to grow before demanding performance. So when people say this is just about a title, they are missing almost everything. This is about transmission. Inheritance, yes, but not only blood inheritance. Temperament. Discipline. Philosophy. A way of standing inside history without making history entirely about yourself. That is what so many people sensed back in Westminster Hall when they saw that 14-year-old boy standing there in silence. They may not have had words for it then, but they felt it. And now, with the title accepted, the old image looks almost prophetic. The boy in vigil. The young man on tour. The prince by choice. That is the full picture. And maybe that is why this story has gathered such unusual force. Not because it offers scandal. Not because it gives people another melodrama to binge. But because buried inside all the ceremony is something almost unfashionably serious. A person who seems to understand that privilege means very little unless it is turned into service. That is what gives this moment weight. That is what gives it emotional force. And that is what may matter most in the years ahead. James did not become compelling because he was called prince. He became compelling because he learned how to bear the title before he ever officially held it. These stories provide insight into how power really survives. Not only through crowns, bloodlines, or grand rituals, but through character. Through the quiet people. Through the ones who stay steady when the room is shaking. Through the ones who choose the harder path without needing applause for it. And in that sense, this story is not really about a title at all. It is about the kind of man who accepted it.